Well, I hope the sound was better on that video that I've uploaded. So this will be the third video. This will be listed as Yeltsin 897 to December 1999. Where I left off was after the creation of the so-called Dream Team, this reshuffle of the cabinet in April. These young reformers went after the oligarchs trying to set up a tax code because most of these oligarchs were not paying taxes or paying very little taxes. And much of the aid from the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and Western countries was being siphoned off by these oligarchs into their offshore bank accounts in Cyprus, in the Cayman Islands, in the English Channel Islands. There were any Luxembourg, wherever they had Switzerland, wherever they had banking laws that were very strict and guaranteed privacy. These crooks, these oligarchs, took much of the aid that was supposedly to revive the economy, and they didn't use it to buy um, Russian assets. They put the money in offshore accounts. They bought property abroad. They sent their children to fancy boarding schools in Western Europe. They vacationed abroad to check up on their money. So, and still, the economy was slowly getting better. People were doing better. They weren't as, most the average Russian citizen was not as bad off as they were, say, in 93. But in 97, there's still um, slow recovery taking place. But these new reformers want to deal with the oligarchs, and so they set about trying to gain some control over them. The problem is that the Nemtsov and Chubais, their only source of strength is their relationship to Yeltsin. And Yeltsin, because the crisis is over, he is now being more lethargic, becoming more ill, being less visible and less active in the government, which puts the reformers at a serious disadvantage versus the oligarchs. And then in the late summer, July to August through September of 1997, you have a phenomenon called the Bankers' Wars. Now, this is a struggle by the oligarchs, who also have banks, remember, so oligarchs and bankers are somewhat synonymous. They are fighting over the the assets of the state that are still being put up for auction, and there are some very potentially lucrative auctions to be held. One particular one that generated this main controversy, the bankers' wars, was over the telephone monopoly. And remember, we talked about the loans for shares plan, how many of these oligarchs had expected to benefit from that. And they're so much fighting among themselves, they don't want anyone to get ahead. So there comes time for the auction of the telephone company. And one of the oligarchs that was on that sheet of oligarchs that I've sent you, Kuczynski, goes to another one, Mikhail Friedman, who has an Alpha Bank, and with the support of Boris Berezovsky, who has been labeled the godfather of the Kremlin because he seems to have his hand in everything that's going on. They get together and they want to put the high bid, which is essentially very low bid, on the telegraph company, or the telephone company. And Potanin, that Potanin, the one who came up with this idea of loans for shares, he expects to receive this company. And so these two oligarchs and all their allies are fighting among themselves over how to distribute this. And they use their media empires to publish embarrassing articles about their opponents. Some of the articles are completely false and just made up. Some of them are true. Remember, all these people have been taking everything, taking advantage of the lax laws because they haven't set up. When you think about establishing a capitalist economy, you need a lot of laws to guarantee property. And Those laws are slowly being passed by the Duma, but this is still what Wags called the Wild East. And many of these oligarchs are associating themselves with former KGB officers who put together private security companies. So it's a pretty crazy, wild time. And Nemtsov and Chubais are trying to get a hold of it, and the bankers are fighting among themselves. So this bankers' war is not a war of guns and bullets, but it's a war of newsprint and television exposés on their opponents that only help to infuriate the average Russian when they see these extremely wealthy new Russians who are constantly fighting among themselves while people are still struggling to get ahead. And part of this got into the fact that many of the people involved, in fact, Chubais was one, and an aide to him was given $100,000 by a bank run by one of the oligarchs to publish a book that was basically a series of lectures. And nobody was going to buy this book, but these banks were finding ways that they could essentially kick back money to people in the government to get their support. Eventually, this settled down. The bankers were passed, but the government of Yeltsin is still pretty shaky. And um, then we moved to March of 1988, when when Yeltsin finally decides that this leadership, that Chernomyrdin, as premier, has not been providing sufficient leadership. He shakes up the government. He gets rid of the premier, Chernomyrdin, and appoints a guy named Sergei Kirienko as his new prime minister. Kirienko is someone who comes out of the Soviet-era Komsomol. He had been involved with the cooperative movement that under Gorbachev. He had set up a number of private companies. He got into banking, got into oil trading, had made a lot of money. Wasn't one of the prime seven oligarchs, but he was a pretty wealthy guy. And the President Yeltsin thought maybe he could be an effective president. Now, the prime minister has to be voted in by the Duma under the new 93 Constitution. And the Duma refuses to vote in Kirienko on the first round. Then there's a second round of voting. Now, if it comes to a third round of voting and the Duma refuses to vote in the president's nominee for prime minister, the Duma is abrogated and there has to be new national elections. So at this point, he was confirmed by the Duma because no one really wanted to go to another national elections. They had just held elections for the Duma, remember, in '95. So you now have a new government set in March, and then you'll see as you look down that page, in May, the world oil prices drop because this is a part of the Asian economic crisis. It starts in Thailand with overvalued money and ripples throughout the world economy. And particularly economies that are struggling, like the Russian economy, are hard hit by this. And this leads to a drop in the price of oil, which is a major source of revenue, the only major source of revenue for the Russian government at the time. The Russian government has to default on its loans to the IMF and the World Bank, and it has to devalue the ruble, which wipes out essentially the savings of that small growing middle class that were slowly advancing as the economy improved. And so this was really devastating news for Russia. And hence, Yeltsin, I think, panics in August of '98, dismisses Kirienko as prime minister, and attempts to bring back Chernomyrdin, thinking that Chernomyrdin can work better with the Duma. He's got ties there. And here, the Duma refuses to put Chernomyrdin back as prime minister. And here Yeltsin backs down because he doesn't want to go through the, the turmoil of a new nationwide election. Yeltsin backs down and appoints Yevgeny Primakov as his prime minister, and the Duma approves this. Now, Primakov's an interesting character because he was an Arabist intelligence officer in the KGB First Directorate. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, he continued to serve in the new Federal Intelligence Service, which has the initials SVR. That's the Foreign Intelligence Service. And in fact, in 91, by Yeltsin, he was appointed the head of the SVR, and he served there from 91 to 96. From 96, at 96 he became the foreign minister, and he was very opposed to the U.S. and NATO intervention in Bosnia and Kosovo, and this is after the collapse of the Yugoslav government and the breakup of Yugoslavia. He was opposed to NATO expansion, bringing in the East European states into NATO, and he was acceptable to the Duma. They approved him. He pushed through, surprisingly, a major tax reform bill that would help to set the Russian economy back on stable footing. And things seem to be going along, and then you turn the page to the next year of 1999, and we're coming to the end of the Yeltsin administration. But before I talk about the event that's on the page, March of 1999, the Yuri Sokoratov affair, I want to talk about what was happening within the Yeltsin administration. Think back for a moment to the Gorbachev years, through the Brezhnev years, to the increasing corruption associated with the gerontocracy, the economy stagnating, but people around Brezhnev beginning to amass private fortunes, something that was unheard of in the real old Soviet Union. The same kind of thing is happening around Yeltsin. Yeltsin is not really the top of his game. He's often absent from the government, spending time in his dacha in the countryside. And one of the main scandals associated with him is the effort to rebuild the palaces in the Kremlin. The Kremlin is this fortress in Moscow, overlooking the Moskva River, that has a number of beautiful old churches that are being restored, and it has a number of palaces and large meeting halls, etc. And as the Soviet Union was collapsing, they didn't have money for maintenance of much of these buildings. So these old churches were suffering from water damage and mold and other things. The buildings were beginning to deteriorate. And so with help of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, they got money to restore these buildings and other presidential buildings around the Russian Federation. And this was a multi-million-dollar contract that went to a Swiss company by the name of Metebex, Mabetex. They, quote, won the bid, although there was a lot of underhanded payoffs to Russian officials to get this bid. And reports were coming out that in the process of getting this bid, between 10 and 15 million dollars was unaccounted for. The company couldn't account for it. The person in the office overseeing this reconstruction was a man named Pavel Borodin, like the composer. Borodin, Borodin. Borodin was head of something called the Presidential Administration. That was one of the 8 elements in the Russian president's office, responsible for the maintenance of all of the buildings that were under the presidential authority, and the Kremlin being the principal one. There were reports coming out that Yeltsin's two daughters had been using American Express black cards, cards that have no limit, and that they were not paying the bills. These bills were paying by other subsidiaries, shady companies, etc. Also, at the same time, in the United States, the state of New York was conducting an investigation about money laundering, and they found that there were people working in the Bank of New York that were actually participating in money laundering schemes for Russian oligarchs. And this was a big scandal. So there are a lot of rumblings going on about these scandals that were taking place. And now I come to Sukharatov. Sukharatov was the general prosecutor of the Russian Federation. Sort of like he's the chief law enforcement officer, like the Attorney General of the United States. And he was conducting investigations into Yeltsin and what is called Yeltsin's family. That's a family in quotes because it's not just his personal biological family, but it's people associated with him, friends and colleagues, all who have been benefiting by access to state funds, etc., and then getting kickbacks from foreign companies making deals with the Kremlin. So he's conducting these investigations, bringing out the scandals about people associated with Yeltsin. And Yeltsin tries to get the Federation Council, the upper house of the parliament, to fire Sukharatov, the Procurator General. They refuse to do that, and Yeltsin is looking on somebody needs to help me do this. Well, it turns out that there is a fellow that has ties to the old KGB working in the Kremlin, and that person, you guessed it, is Vladimir Putin. And apparently Putin, the can-do guy of the past, goes to some of his former friends in the KGB, and they come up with a videotape of Sukharatov in bed with two young female prostitutes who are known to have ties to certain underworld figures. And this creates a scandal because what they're trying to do is use what the Russians call compromat, Kompromat, compromising material to force him out of office. And initially, Sukharatov, and this is so typically male Russian, says, yes, I did it, and what do I have to be ashamed of? I can take two women to bed at the same time. But the scandal goes on, and he begins to realize that this was not something I should have said. He backs off, says he never said that, but there's recorded evidence, and eventually Sukharatov has to resign. He's under too much pressure. But all this is, fodder for opponents of Yeltsin, and the government is under Primakov is becoming fairly effective, and that, from Yeltsin's perspective, is a problem because Yeltsin wants to pick his successor, and there are new presidential elections scheduled for 2000, and Primakov is acting as if he is the heir apparent to Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin is so ill, most people think he's not likely to try to run, and Primakov thinks he's got a lock for the position, and Yeltsin wants to be able to pick his successor. And so, what does he do but fire Primakov and bring in a new young fellow, Sergei Stepashin, who has served in the Interior Ministry, has served in the FSB, the successor of the domestic KGB. He has served as Justice Minister and as Interior Minister. So he's got a pretty impressive record, but he doesn't seem to fit well with Yeltsin. He's appointed prime minister in May, and in August, Yeltsin appoints a new prime minister, and that's Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin now is one step away from the presidency. In September of '99, there's some terrible tragedies taking place. There are a number of apartment bombings in Russia. And there are reports that some people believe, and there's some credible evidence, that these were bombings placed by the intelligence service, the FSB. Why? To turn public attention away from all these scandals around the president and the upcoming election, and turn the Russian hatred, turn the view again to Chechnya. So let's go back to where we left off Chechnya in '94. Well, if you remember, in '96, after the election, President Yeltsin cut a deal with Alexander Lebed to take over the National Security Council. And he specifically at that point charged Lebed to go to Chechnya and work out a peace deal. Now, everyone expected Lebed to fail. They thought this was one way that Yeltsin cleverly would be able to get rid of another potential contender for the throne by giving him an impossible assignment. But to the shock of everyone, Lebed negotiates a ceasefire with the Chechens and comes back and presents Yeltsin with a fait accompli. And the ceasefire is supposedly to last for 5 years, and it is supposedly to give the Chechen government a chance to reorganize and gain control of its territory without the need for the Russian army anymore. But the Chechen government is not able to control these now increasingly rebels who are committed to Islamic fundamentalism and that don't want to just be a part of the Soviet Union or of the Russian Federation. They want to overthrow the Russian Federation and spread their fundamentalist version of Islam. So the apartment bombings are blamed on the Chechens. Everyone expects this. Later, as I said, there comes out some pretty disturbing evidence that it may have been the KGB. And the Russian army in September reinvades Chechnya and now begins the Second Chechen War. As a result of these apartment bombings, and Putin is the prime minister directing the government, he goes to Chechnya to visit the Russian troops, passes out lots of medals to them, praises them for their valor and their battle against these crazy Chechens. But remember, we come back now to domestic politics, the fact that there's an election coming up. And if you look down, you'll see in October, Lushkov, you can go back to the overhead that I sent you of the oligarchs. Lushkov, certainly not the wealthiest, but he's powerfully politically connected because he's the mayor of Moscow. And here you have the mayor of Moscow and the former prime minister, Yevgeny Primakov, joining together to form this party, ORV, which stands for Fatherland All Russia Party, a combine of their two factions. And they expect to win the upcoming Duma elections in December and expect then that they will be able to pick probably one of them, most likely Primakov, would become the new president of Russia in the elections that will be held in 2000. And so now this is another dilemma for the Yeltsin administration, because it looks like holding free and fair elections, they are going to be overwhelmed by this new party because of the political connections of Lushkov and Primakov. And lo and behold, Boris Berezovsky, again one of these wealthy oligarchs who's on that list I gave you, the godfather of the Kremlin, helps to organize overnight a new political party called Unity, a party that basically has no program other than to support the government. And now you need to look at the December 1999 overhead that I think I've sent you, and if not, I am going to send it today to you, that looks at the vote for the Duma elections. And you'll see that the communists still do pretty well. They get 25% of the vote. But this new party that came out of nowhere and is a supposed inheritor of the party of power, that vague term that supposedly means the party supports the government, gets 16% of the vote. Fatherland All Russia, the party of Lushkov and Primakov, only gets 15% of the seats. And then others, Union of Right Forces, which is a party associated with Boris Nemtsov, the Liberal Democrats associated with the Siranovsky, the Yabloko, associated with the economist Yevlinsky, a really true Democrat. They get a few seats and a smattering of others. So this is a sign that Lushkov and Primakov are not going to be able to pick the next president. Communists, you see, are still strong in the Duma. The nationalists are still strong. But now you've got another party that is committed to the president. And during this election campaign, the opponents put out lots of political compromising material, political compromise, black information about the Lushkov-Primakov era. And then, after the election results are posted, at the end of the year, Boris Yeltsin goes on television December 31st and announces that he's sorry that he hasn't been more effective leader. He says he's tried his best, but he feels he needs to resign and turn the government over to newer and younger leadership. And the Constitution that he pushed through in '93 says that if the president resigns before his term is up, the prime minister becomes acting president until the next election. And there's another provision in there that the election has to be moved up a certain number of months. So they're going to have an early election for the president in the year 2000. And this new party that came out of nowhere, Unity, is going to be the party backing Vladimir Putin. And Boris Berezovsky thinks that he has helped to groom Putin to be the next president. And he is essentially thinks himself as a kingmaker of Russian politics. And he and the other oligarchs are going to put their money behind Putin as the next president. And so I'm at 28 minutes here on this video. I've covered the highlights of the last few years of the Yeltsin administration. I'm going to end this video now, and then later in this week I'll start on the videos for the Putin administration. And I'll start with his background, and I'll be sending you a whole set of new videos. All right. I hope this was a little easier to follow. I've tried to slow down, but I do tend to speak rapidly. But hopefully I can now get this video posted up successfully. And if you have any questions, any issues, remember, send me emails. Send them to me. Let me know what you're doing, how you are, what are your thoughts, any suggestions, etc. I've looked into getting a microphone, as Ian, who has suggested this by email, and they have them at the university. I'm trying to get them to send me by mail a microphone because I am essentially I'm not sick, but I have some conditions that I really shouldn't be going out, driving, mingling with other people. The only thing I'm doing outside is walking the dog, and it's just the two of us staying away from everyone. So I can't get to the campus to get the microphone, but hopefully we'll work something out. All right. I hope you're doing well. Stay safe and keep reading.